What's the youth unemployment situation looking like now? And why is this what they quote, the priority of priorities from the government?
Yeah, well, youth unemployment has hit record highs last year of over 20% in mid last year. Now it's come down quite a bit to just under 15% in April, but that's only after the government had changed the methodology for collecting the data. They had excluded students from the data set. And analysts that I've been speaking to say that this likely downplays the actual picture of unemployment because many of these students, they look for jobs quite early while they're still in school. So whether they can get a job really tells us a great deal about how the overall health of the labor market. So last year, I would say it's about the number of youths unemployed is about 2 to 3% of the labor force. Now it's just about 0.6%. So it's a small number. But the important thing is youths, they represent an outsized proportion of people who spend money in the economy because youths are the one going to the cinemas, to concerts. They are different from their parents' generation in that they tend to think less of the long-term financial goals. So if the government wants to get the economy going again and get people to spend again, they need to focus on the young people, make sure they have the income to spend and they are gainfully employed.
Yeah, and the skills mismatch, too, that they need to close, right? That was one of the things I think Chinese President Xi Jinping talked about. What measures have been talked about to address these concerns? And these are structural concerns, too.
Yeah, so previously they have come up with, I would say, rather piecemeal measures. There were tax incentives and subsidies to get governments to employ young graduates, but these amounts were ranging from 1,000 to 2,000 yuan, so they're quite low. It's like over 100 to 300 plus dollars. That's not a huge amount to incentivize companies to hire, especially when the outlook for the economy is not great. So they need to kind of sort that out first. But it's a chicken and egg problem because how are you going to get people to spend when their income is not there, and how are you going to get people to hire when the economy is not good? And then they have to sort out the education mismatch problem. And that's something I think we want to look out for, whether there will be any reforms in the pipeline come July during the party plenum. They have been trying to improve or upgrade the vocational education system, but that's facing a lot of resistance from parents because there's still a lot of stigma about sending your kids to vocational school instead of colleges.
All right, Min, stick around. Our China correspondent, Min Lo, there for more. Let's bring in our next guest, Wang, Chief Asia-Pacific Economist at Vanguard Group, to have a deeper look into, of course, the unemployment situation in China. Wang, it's always great to have you. First of all, even after they changed the methodology, we're still talking about a youth unemployment rate at around 15%, which is still a couple times higher than the national headline figures. But I got to wonder, why is it so high in your eyes? Is it something that's more cyclical or actually structural?
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne and David. Thank you for having me today. I think you're right. I mean, even after they changed the methodology, it's still much higher than the headline unemployment rate. Now, actually, that is pretty common. Youth unemployment is always higher than the aggregate unemployment rate, across many different countries because, young workers, they are usually don't really have the experience or skills. But I think in China, 15% is still high. And also, I think what is alarming is also that over the past several years, if you look at the old series, right, it was first reported in 2008 and it kept rising, right? So in 2008, that number started at 9.6%. And, before it was suspended last June, it was already over 20%. So there was a rising trend there. I think that is more concerning. Part of this is, I think, the weak economy over the past several years, right? We have trade war, we have pandemic, we have regulatory tightening, and even today, we see the economy is still a weak and gradual recovery, right? Normalization after the pandemic. Even by the end of this year, the output gap will still be negative. So this is really not a very strong economy. And a second thing I would also say, as we just mentioned, there is a structural mismatch between the labor supply and demand. The economy recovery so far is really, mostly on the low-end service industry benefiting migrant worker. On the other hand, the middle to high-end service industry that hires a lot of new graduates that actually suffer from regulatory tightening or persistent, structural headwinds, right? So even manufacturing boom, over the past, several quarters, right? But we all know that manufacturing is much less labor intensive. than service. And also, I think that the recent boom is actually on the high-end manufacturing, which is more technology incentive. So many of the college graduates, even they are willing to work in those, manufacturing sector, they don't have the skills,
Yeah, so talk to us then about, a lot of this also comes down to how we count and statistics, right? And, there could be, there could be people who are choosing to skip finding that first job and going straight into, say, going for the master's degree, otherwise they would have, done a few years and then did the master's. There would also be people, I would imagine, because they see what's happening in the labor market, just choosing to sit out and them now not being counted in the labor force. What is your estimate of the labor force right now? Is it shrinking or is it actually expanding?
Yeah, I think that's why I think we shouldn't just look at the unemployment rate. That's one indicator, right, to gauge the overall labor market conditions. One thing I think it was not captured by the unemployment rate is really the declining, labor force participation rate, right, especially among the younger generation, right? As you mentioned, I think a large part of that is because they are discouraged. They have weak confidence in this labor market, their job, prospect or, income growth. So they choose to stay home, and then they prepare for civil servant or graduate program exams. So, that actually has an impact on their income and overall consumption, as you just mentioned earlier. And also, I think another thing that may not be captured by the unemployment rate is that underemployment as well, right? So, based on the statistic methodology, as long as you work 1 hour in a week, then you are counted as employed, right? However, if you look at, headline news, you do see that self-employed individual, they are getting less orders, or there's people are having less working hours. That's underemployment as well.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because if you just go online and look at any recruitment platforms in China now, you'd find that so many jobs have requirements for master's degree when the role doesn't really justify it. I'm talking about roles like office receptionist, and it's because there's just this glut of people with master's degree now, and it's an employer's market right now. And so that's also my next question, because so many of these graduates, they're expecting to work in real estate, in banking, in tech. These are all the sectors that have been facing regulatory scrutiny and crackdowns and that aren't hiring as much as before. And the government knows that they need to reform the education system to ensure that the students come out with skills that fit the needs of the economy. But how do you think they're going to go about this?
Yeah. I think one thing you just mentioned about, master's student, PhD student, right? China actually has been expanding the graduate program admission significantly in the past several years, especially during the pandemic, started in 2020. That kind of delayed the, undergraduate students' unemployment. However, it doesn't really solve the problem. They just kick the can down the road, and now they are coming to the market as well. So to that extent, it's not just the age group 19 to 24 unemployment rate is going to pick up in the graduate season. It's also the age group of 25 to 29 unemployment rate. I think in terms of the government, what they can do, right? I think to a certain extent they can encourage state sector, either the civil servant jobs or state-owned enterprises to hire college graduate, or they can expand the postgraduate program. This does not really solve the fundamental problem. The education reform you just mentioned, it takes years, to have an impact on the labor market. I think ultimately, at this moment, the most important thing is still about the economy, right? You literally need to boost up the economy and also the confidence, especially in the private sector, right? Private sector hires more than 80%, contributes to over 80% of the total employment, especially those new graduates. So if the private sector business confidence is low, they are not willing to invest, they are not willing to hire, then of course, then consumers won't have the confidence, and of course those college graduates either.